You're listening to Fire Ecology Chats, a podcast series by the Association for Fire Ecology.
Hello, everyone. My name is Bob Keane. I'm the editor-in-chief of the internationally renowned journal Fire Ecology. And recently we had a paper published in Fire Ecology that was kind of different from most of our papers, and it was incredibly interesting. The name of the paper is Yosemite's Merced Grove of Giant Sequoias. Critical restoration continues despite legal challenges. And we have two very special people here to talk about this paper. We have the senior author, Kristen Shive. Could you introduce yourself, Kristen?
I'm an assistant cooperative extension specialist at UC Berkeley.
And we also have another co-author, Scott Stevens. Scott was one of the directors of AFI, and I want to thank you for coming on, Scott. Can you introduce yourself to the people?
Sure, Bob, I'm happy to do so. Scott Stevens, Professor of Fire Science, Forest Policy at UC Berkeley.
Well, welcome both of you, and let's talk about this really interesting paper. Kristen, give us a little thumbnail sketch of what the paper's all about.
Sure. So as most of your listeners know, in those historically frequent fire forests of the Western U.S., particularly like giant sequoia groves, the cessation of fire really led to fuel buildup, and now we're getting these large, severe fires that are pretty uncharacteristic. And specifically, the giant sequoias are a really limited distribution species. They're also some of the oldest, largest trees on Earth. And in the last 10 years, we've lost nearly 20% of them to high severity fire. There's really a big threat there. And that really applies to the mixed conifer forests that surround them as well. The thing is, though, to avoid that threat, we know what we need to do, right? We need to do fuel reduction treatments that include mechanical thinning and prescribed burning. And this has been shown over and over again. But it's really hard to get that work done. There's tons of challenges, staffing, funding, you name it. But another one can be litigation. In 2022, Yosemite National Park really was taking brave measures to go out and do a bunch of thinning in Merced Grove and other lands in the park, which was subsequently sued. And that litigation really rested on a lot of flawed science. And so what made us want to write this paper was sort of an inspiring story where the park really stood their ground. They leaned on the best available science and they prevailed. And, they went through the appeal process, and now that critical work has continued, and hopefully the burn will get done this fall. And then we're going to have a really resilient grove going into the future.
Well, that'd be great. Really, really be nice. So, Scott, how does this paper and the whole litigation thing, how does it fit into the greater restoration picture of the Sierra Nevada forest?
No, I think it fits in really well. Kristen just talked about this grove tried to be burned for almost 40 years by park staff. It's in a difficult spot in terms of just access, also kind of forest around it. It was also threatened by wildfires multiple times in the last 20, 25 years. So you think about that as a backdrop, then you look at Sierra Nevada forests in general, they're really in deplorable shape, many of them. Haven't burned in a century, large trees cut, really high fire hazard. So work just needs to happen in earnest. I've always been a little bit frustrated, to be honest with you, in our pace and scale in California. We aren't getting the work done necessary to conserve our forests into the future. And as Kristen said, there's a lot of different reasons: funding, resources, personnel, and then sometimes these lawsuits come forward. So I just think it's an impediment that we need to really go after sometimes as well, just to show the work can be done is totally justified. And that's why we wrote the paper.
Yeah, that part is really, really interesting to me. So I know what's really important is the history of this area, especially the history of the management of this grove. So, Kristen, can you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, as Scott kind of touched on, we've been trying to get restoration work done in there for some time. In contrast, over in the Mariposa Grove, there's been prescribed fire there for 50 years. In the Merced Grove, a tiny portions of them burned 3 times in that same time period. It was really a dense fuel-loaded mess. The reason that work hadn't gotten done is, as Scott kind of alluded to, you've got really steep terrain. You're right on the border with the National Forest, which makes that coordination pretty difficult. And the surrounding fuels are just also kind of a nightmare. I worked there first in 2002, and they had been trying to burn it again since the last burn had been at least 10 years ago. And they were trying in desperation to get it to burn again, but the complexity was too high for those operations. I went back to work in the park in 2016, and they still hadn't been able to pull it off. And so finally they concluded, we need to reduce the complexity of this burn. Of course, there's multiple ways you can do that, and one is to reduce those tree densities. And so they did that so that now fire managers are feeling a lot more optimistic about the ability to put fire on the ground. And it couldn't come too soon. As Scott mentioned, there's been a bunch of fires that have threatened the Merced Grove, and it's really survived by, to some extent, good luck. And we don't want to rely on that.
So one thing I found really interesting in the paper is what the importance of science was for the parks to make a decision. God, could you tell us how important was science in the whole idea of clarifying the issue for managers and litigation?
The science was paramount. I really have to give credit to the park staff that actually did this. The former superintendent, Cicely Muldoon, and then Garrett Dickman, the second author of this paper. Both these people were instrumental in saying we need to go forward with this project, just like Kristen alluded, because we need to get this grove in better shape. We don't want to lose another one. So they came forward and said, we're going to really go forward on this project. They were sued, and then people wrote some letters of support. Other things were actually given to the case. One thing about the science, too, we know the science is incredibly important. Sometimes the science has to be a little more digestible to things like courts and people that are looking at this data that aren't scientists. So some work was drawn upon that was a little more summary in characteristic that allowed court and other people to actually understand the issues some more. So as Kristen said, I give the park a lot of credit. They really stood firm. It's pretty easy in a court setting to say, okay, let's just compromise and do this, right? And a lot of times when you do that, you lose the long-term sustainability of these ecosystems. So former superintendent and Garrett decided, no, we're into this and we're going to try to go forward and present the case and show why the science we used was sound and maybe the science that was actually in the other side of the coin wasn't as strong. And lo and behold, the courts found that to be completely the case. So I think it really is important for us sometimes to step in these areas. And it's a little bit odd for ecologists to do this, right? But I know more and more folks are doing it, and I give people credit for that. So it really did work in this case, and the project went forward. I've been there several times, not as much as Kristen, but it looks darn good.
That's great. Yeah, it's really hard for researchers that do research in the area to advocate an issue while trying to remain unbiased. It's kind of a really sharp-edged sword. Kristen, do you want to recognize anybody else or your funding agencies before we say goodbye?
We wrote this on our own dime, so to speak, but I do want to just reiterate Garrett Dickman, the other co-author, who is a park employee that was really the project lead for this work, to commend him not just for helping with the paper, but also for pushing the work forward.
I was so glad when you guys agreed to go ahead and do a podcast for this because this is such an important issue and it's a great paper for the journal Fire Ecology. And I want to thank you for both writing the paper and for taking your time and coming on the podcast. Thank you, you two.
Thanks, Bob.
And if anybody that's listening wants to read this paper, guess what? You can download it for free. Scott and Kirsten have already paid the freight for you to go ahead and download the paper. So please go to our website, download the paper, and enjoy a wonderful paper that describes everything about burning in the sequoia groves. Thanks again, and we'll see you on the next Fire Ecology Chat.
Thank you for listening to Fire Ecology Chats, a podcast series by the Association for Fire Ecology. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to our show and leave us a review. To learn more about fire ecology and support our future work by becoming a member, visit fireecology.org. FIREECOLOGY.org.